Welcome everyone. So today on this Water Well with CWEL series, we have Emily Melhorn, who is from Flagstaff, Arizona. She is water conservation specialist for the city of Flagstaff Water Services, and she has double masters in sustainable communities and masters in planning from Northern Arizona University. And today she will be talking about water efficient landscape policies that Flagstaff implemented, and it dates back to a long time, which was interesting to find out, but we'll find out more, and we'll learn about how Flagstaff was successful in developing a really good strategy to conserve water and go through the droughts. So without further ado, I welcome Emily Melhorn, and I leave it up to you. You can start sharing your screen or do whatever you wish.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Again, my name is Emily Melhorn. I'm the water conservation specialist for the city of Flagstaff. Really excited to talk about this today. A little more info about me. I grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I didn't really think that much about water conservation. And it wasn't until moving west that I really started to think about not only water conservation in an arid place, but also conservation across the board. I lived in the Western states for my entire adult life, even nearby in Kemmer, Wyoming, and in Virgin, Utah for a period of time. I am a master gardener. So for me, efficient outdoor watering practices is something I feel particularly passionate about within the scope of my current work as a conservation specialist. Just to kind of give you an overview of the program, to load it up front, I really want to talk about how, having good policy and ordinances are essential to creating the structure to get things accomplished within your municipality. It allows for some of the passive things to happen if you don't have the resources and the staff to do it. So ordinances, good policy is incredibly important. But in the question of enforcing that policy, you really need to have a staff, and resources are essential to making your programs more successful. And lastly, I would say the thing that's probably the most important is to have education of your neighbors, and creating a buy-in from your community is honestly best, since you can't enforce 24/7. It's just not practical. So really having that community support, community buy-in is essential. So great, we'll dive right in. So a little bit of information about Flagstaff for those of you who have never visited. We are at 7,000 feet elevation. We do have 4 seasons here. I know a lot of people think of Arizona as mostly, a lot of cactus and saguaros. We have the largest ponderosa pine forest in North America. We are a high desert climate. 22 inches of rain a year, and the majority of that rain actually happens in July and August. So enforcement for us in particular is really important in May and June right now, because it's really warm out, it's summertime, but there is no rain anywhere. So really making sure that people are following our ordinances during this time of year is particularly critical. As well, so a lot of information about our city population, and I'll have you, go ahead and take a look there. The biggest takeaways from all of that is that we have a very frequently shifting population due to our high cost of living here. We have a lot of students who are only here for a couple of years. We have a lot of visitors. We also have a lot of second homes, and those second home owners tend to come in the summer during our when water enforcement is at its peak. So the point is that both enforcement and education about our ordinances is an ongoing process because our population shifts frequently. As well, because of our high cost of living, a lot of Airbnb rentals, et cetera, there is a lot of separation between who owns the property, who is actually living there, and who pays the water bill. So the question of who exactly are we trying to educate, who is incentivized to change their behavior, and who benefits from the various rebates that we have that try to encourage more water efficient landscaping. That changes all the time with the type of population that we have, and certainly something to consider within your own communities. And as well for the 56 homeowners associations that we have, even sometimes homeowners don't entirely have a say in their landscaping. There are sometimes, HOA rules that maybe come into a little bit of conflict between our ordinances. So that's another aspect of education and enforcement that we need to consider. Yeah, and I guess lastly, just also thinking that, we do have 5.5 million visitors annually, which is much larger than our population. And visitors, maybe don't conserve water as much as they do when they're at home. You go on vacation and there's a lot of things you do differently. You eat more, high caloric foods, or, all sorts of different changes that you make from your regular routine when you're on vacation. And as well, trying to get that message of water conservation and why it particularly matters in our arid environment to visitors who are here for maybe a week, of course, is another important factor as well. So, all right. So I'm going to go a little bit into our ordinance history. Now, way back in 1988, City of Flagstaff decided to put on the books a water conservation ordinance. It defined what wasting water actually entailed according to the city. And of course, the overall goal of this original ordinance and how it's evolved over time is to reduce water usage, but also to eliminate wasteful practices. As well, we established our every other day watering rule. But however, back in 1988, it was only once it reached the level 2 of drought. So it wasn't on the books like all the time. Also in 1988 to 2003, so for 15 years, we started toilet rebate, we started reclaimed water, we have a tiered water rate structure that helps encourage conservation. However, in those first 15 years, there's no staff that's actively doing conservation. And as well, as far as the every other watering rules, that level 2 drought didn't actually start until 2003. This is when we had a major drought. And in this, during this time, this 2002, 2003, there was no surface water anywhere in Flagstaff. And they had to drill a lot more wells to access groundwater. And that is incredibly expensive for Flagstaff because we have to drill thousands of feet below to actually access our groundwater. And they realized at that time that that's really expensive. But what's much cheaper is to have a conservation staff. So for the first time ever, after 15 years, they finally have staff to support water conservation, as well as expanding the rebates, education, all of that. But in 2003, because of the drought, they also revised the water ordinance that the watering rules, the every other day rule, happens all the time. It's not just during drought, but they decided that it was a good practice overall to do on a consistent basis. As well, in our ordinance history, we also established a toilet code in 2009. Still to this day, our toilet code is 1.28 gallons per flush. This is more efficient than national standards and even our state standard. It is 1.6 gallons per flush. And Flagstaff decided to do this all the way back in 2009. Additional things about our ordinance history. In 2009, affected us here and probably everywhere else, the Great Recession. The water conservation staff lost 89% of its budget. So there was no longer any staff, there were no rebates, there was no one to enforce our watering rules, which were now consistent all the time, every other day. So the decision that they made in 2002, where it was much cheaper to conserve than to drill for new wells, it didn't really apply anymore because we actually had water at that moment. So if we were going to cut from our overall budget conservation, it was decided that we didn't need it at that time. Because of that, it wasn't until 2011 that we introduced one staff member, but that person was only part-time. They only did conservation part of the time and then did other water services. As well, we still looked to, we reinstated our turf rebate. We also looked at a rain barrel program for rebate for water conservation in landscaping. It wasn't until 2014 that we really started to look into kind of rebuild the staff for our programs. We had 2 part-time enforcement staff people. So we're starting to get to the sense of like, we need people specifically devoted to enforcement. The photo up there on the top right-hand side, that is Bob. He is still with us today. He worked in water services for a number of years, retired, and now does this part-time seasonally during our summer months. So 2015, we also start to hand out free rain barrels, as well as doing a rebate for large scale rainwater harvesting. And then once again, of course, in 2020, we had a disruption, as many places did as well. We ended up slashing our enforcement hours by 60% during that time, because people weren't really sure what was going to happen with the pandemic. So we took a pause on hiring any of our seasonal people. So we reduced our enforcement by 60%. We had staff that wasn't as well trained in enforcement. And this, of course, all happened during 2020, when the concept of like outdoor living, really became more of a huge boost. All of the things on Pinterest or articles that you were looking at, everybody wanted to spend time outdoors, and we didn't really have as much staff to be able to look after enforcement and make sure that people were watering efficiently. And also during that time, in 2020, we also chose to change our toilet rebate to better reflect the ordinance that we created in 2009. So from the period of 2009 to 2020, we had a tiered rebate that when people were replacing their toilets to meet them to code, we would give them money. But we'd finally decided, we've had this ordinance for 11 years. Maybe we should stop giving people money to follow the law. So at that point, our rebate is now to go even lower than 1.28 gallons per flush. And people will get a rebate if they go lower than what's required by law in Flagstaff. All right, so getting a little bit into what exactly our water ordinance entails. So you've heard me say previously, every other day. This graphic here up top actually talks about that. So if your address ends in an even number, you water on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If you have an odd address, you're at Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So the every other day, this is to, plants actually prefer deeper, less frequent watering. So this is to utilize our water efficiently. And Monday, just no watering at all. There's 7 days in a week. We had to figure out how to, conserve our water that way. As well, as many of you, if you are landscapers, gardeners, there's no watering between 9 and 5. And that's because for us, it's the hottest part of the day. We want to see less evaporation, and we want to conserve our water resources by just not having anyone water between the hours of 9 and 5. Also wanted to, I talked about how we have a definition of what wasting water is. And I'm not going to read all of that, but essentially it's also to include things like if a spray irrigation is going on the sidewalk, or otherwise, water is running into the street and gutters. If you're happen to be irrigating when it's raining outside, that would be considered wasting water. And failing to repair any kind of water leaks. So the wasting water has been there since 1988. The every other day rule has been in practice and the law since 2003. All right, also on that, I have a photo of our water conservation car. But we actually did enforcement on bikes in the beginning, and we still do when it's convenient. All right, so of course, our enforcement strategy has evolved over time, and we didn't necessarily always get things right in the beginning, and over time, we've learned how to be more efficient with our resources and more effective in getting education out there. So again, for the first 15 years, we have this ordinance, it exists, but there is no staff. In the period of this 15-year period, were people wasting water by, by having water on the sidewalks, leaks, etc.? Absolutely. This was happening in our community, but it's not really on anybody's radar. There's nobody within the city of Flagstaff that's actually looking after this ordinance violations. Of course, for a 5-year period, we have a drought, and we finally decide to get a staff that's devoted to water conservation. And of course, the enforcement of every other watering rules starts then. And during this period of time, there really wasn't a strategy, per se. As staff were going about their business around town, if they happened to spot a violation, they would follow up with it. And of course, they were very, very passionate during this time. We were in a drought, so they really wanted to make sure that people were conserving water, particularly outdoor watering use. But, it wasn't like they never dedicated time specifically to enforcement. And the rules were established at that time that you got a warning the first time, you got a warning the second time, and at the third time, it was a violation and you were fined $25. And this was put on your watering bill. And the fines doubled after that. So $50, after that, and $100, etc. And they did start to do educational outreach. On the right-hand side in the top corner there, you'll see the first little educational piece that they started to hand out to people to let them know about the watering rules. Now, of course, in 2009, we lose our staff for water conservation and enforcement of these strategies. We lost it for a period of time. And during this, it is actually citizens that are completely the driver of who we investigate that are violating our watering rules. I will say that, in 2009, we received 80 complaints from customers, from citizens who were saying, hey, my neighbor is watering at the wrong time. And there were other water staff who tried to do what they could, and they investigated about 20 of them, so about a quarter of them. In 2010, there's absolutely no water enforcement being done at all. And you did start to get staff in 2011, but somebody who's, working part-time doesn't really have the capacity to do enforcements when they're also doing education, rebates, basically doing everything that a full staff used to do. And of course, I will say here that citizens reporting is somewhat of a mixed blessing. We still rely on that somewhat to this day, but sometimes it's not entirely about neighbors wanting their other, wanting the people in their community to conserve water. It's somewhat obvious to us sometimes when a citizen just has a beef with their neighbor, for other reasons. They don't like them for other reasons that have nothing to do with water conservation. So we find ourselves sometimes, getting involved in that. So you want to have community buy-in. It's great that it's there as a resource for concerned citizens to be able to let us know when the watering rules aren't being followed. But like I said, it's certainly a mixed blessing. So during the interim period from 2014 to 15, we really start to get a mix of citizens, reporting, but we're also starting the process where we're actually driving or on bike, going around neighborhoods and actually seeing, who is maybe violating the watering rules. In 2014, we also start, when we notice a violation, we have the door hangers that we put on. Prior to that period of time, when somebody, one of our staff noticed a violation, we, create a mail and we mail them the violation, which of course there's so much longer lag time and delay with that people, just might continue to not know any better and continue to violate the watering rules. Whereas the door hanger was a little bit more immediate, that they saw it right away. As well, we started more educational efforts. We would go to the farmers market on Sundays and spend 5 hours out of the week, our enforcement staff, just talking to people and educating them about what exactly the watering rules were. So they start to finally kind of get that together. We have our very first watering rules magnet, and that's the one that's in the center there on the right-hand side. We would hand out to people to kind of remind them when was their day to water. So yes, and we also during this period of time start to work out our strategy, and we start to move a little bit more into data collection. And we're really starting to see that there are certain neighborhoods where we're seeing repeat offenders or just figuring out who the repeat offenders are year after year. It sort of got lost in the shuffle when there was no one entirely minding the store on a more consistent basis. As well, I will say, we investigated a lot of places that didn't necessarily come to fruition with violations, but we started to understand the bigger picture of which neighborhoods we needed to target. Now, starting in 2016, to the present, we really started to finalize our strategy, and we've had a lot of greater successes since then. So we have a staff, they have a strategy, they know where they need to, go to best utilize our limited resources with our part-time staff. Another thing we start doing is actually handing out water-saving devices to first-time violators. So when they're patrolling and they see somebody who isn't following the watering rules, they'll step out and they'll hand them a nice cloth bag full of, there's a moisture meter that helps them save water. There's an efficient hose nozzle, and all sorts of other goodies in that, which, furthers the goal of, they're going to save water by using these devices, which is absolutely what we want, but it's a much friendlier interaction. And this person, doesn't feel like they've, we're shaking our, tiny fists at them for not violating, for violating the rules. They feel much better about that because we've given them a lot of free stuff, and it's a much more friendlier interaction. And they're much more likely to then follow the rules, because we found the vast majority of the time, people are not flagrantly violating our rules. They just don't know that this exists. Again, we have a population that changes quite a bit. So in that sense, our education and just getting the word out has to happen all the time. And for the most part, people just don't know that this ordinance exists. Giving them free stuff helps tremendously in smoothing over that process. And they don't feel threatened by us, notifying them that they haven't been following the rules. They change their behavior and everything goes really well. We occasionally get, a little bit more of a libertarian streak, and we might have to move it along a little bit further. But for the most part, your average person that we're encountering, it's one time we let them know, they change their practices. As well, something that we continued to do a lot from 2016 to the present, we started to rely a lot more on advertising, radio advertising, newspaper, our, watering magnet now, the every other day with the blue colors and the, orange there for Mondays. That image we've been using a lot through our advertising and social media. We also created a lot of videos that were kind of, goofy and funny. We wanted to educate people in a way that would feel, enjoyable to them. And again, not creating this, we're the water police and, we want to tell you what you're doing wrong, but to kind of make it fun and explain why we have this water ordinance. And so as well, we also just worked with better design. The phrase "a picture is worth 1,000 words," so if you have really compelling visuals, people will also better understand and be more willing to follow your ordinances. As well, in the last couple of years, we've also had increased efficiency in our data collection methods, and technology has also been another important part. Now we use a GIS application so that when we see a water violation, you take the photos with your smartphone, you enter the data in, you can see right away, is this the first or second violation? And it looks over a long period of time, whether or not this person has violated our ordinance in the past. And it goes so much more quickly, whereas before they'd be out there writing on handwritten notes, and then they have to go back to the office and enter it into, spreadsheets and all that. This is so much more efficient, and that technology has allowed us to cover a lot more territory a lot more quickly. All right, so what is the end result of all of this evolution of our strategy? And I do want to, make this super clear. So I've got this one graph here, and it's from the period of, roughly it's from 1989 to 2015. So we cut our outdoor watering use in half since the beginning of our ordinance, starting in 1988, that defined wasting water. So we reduced over the course of 27 years, we reduced our use in outdoor watering use in half. However, in the past 7 years, we've reduced that yet another 50%. So the difference of it took us 27 years to cut our water use in half. It only took 7 years to cut it another 50%, because we actually had a staff that was able to enforce and educate people about our watering rules. So hope I made that clear enough that it really does make a difference if you're trying to reduce your water, to have education, to have people who are actually minding the ordinance is incredibly important to be successful. I will say that the number of fines that we received each year, and you can see a little bit about each year, our highest number of fines were actually after the drought ended in 2005. It was a little bit of a strategy. The emergency had supposedly ended. We weren't in drought anymore. And so there was a little bit more pushback from the community. They're like, why do we still have to do this? We're not in drought anymore. And there was that sort of conversation of, well, this is a good idea to have all the time. So yes, so there was a little bit there during 2005 where we did actually get into the double fines territory, where people just did not want to follow the rules, and we're a little salty about it, I guess you could say. And during the periods, the later years, in 2017 and 18, we really started to look at, and target the repeat offenders who had been doing this kind of thing for almost a decade, but we had such spotty enforcement, that they weren't necessarily being followed through. I can say that those people are not doing that anymore now that we've had targeted enforcement and we've been able to go after our repeat offenders. We're actually seeing the number of violations drop here in the last couple of years. And a large part of that is, people are putting in fake grass, they're doing more xeriscaping. And also our climate has shifted on certain years. We had one year where there was a lot of rain in May, which is very atypical for us. But a lot of people had the good sense to, not water their lawns while it was raining. Although we still have that quite a bit sometimes, because if somebody has set their irrigation schedule and they're not remotely near Flagstaff, let's say that they own the property and they live elsewhere, they're going to have a lot more, they're not going to know it's raining in Flagstaff. So they might do that, and we'd still have to, give some violations. But for people who are actually here, they know to shut it off, and I will say for that too, we still have a little bit more, difficulties in changing the behavior of some of our chain businesses than we do with locally owned businesses as well. It hasn't gone to a fine situation yet, but it takes them a little bit. They might get a second warning instead of it just stopping at the first. And that's because, there's a chain of command that you have to go up to. Like, we might inform the manager that they're not following the watering rules, but they need to, check with headquarters back in some other state, because it might be the chain's policy to do this, on certain days. So we do need to work a little bit more with our chains than we do with local businesses. It takes a little bit longer. But usually by the time that they realize that they're going to start getting fines on their water bill, they'll change their practices. So, yeah, so, the overall, message in all of this, that, having an ordinance, having enforcement, this is all well and good, but education really is the key to be water efficient in landscaping. And for all of our success, we realize that people, customers can still be inefficient with their outdoor watering use and still be technically following our ordinance. If they're watering their grass at like 6 o'clock in the morning for way too long, for like an hour, they're still wasting water. They're not being, as efficient as they could be. So for the future for us, we're looking a lot more at efficient irrigation, telling people like how much should they be watering their lawns and their plants, and how not to overwater. We've also, of course, looking a lot at rainwater harvesting, not only how to harvest it, but maybe how to integrate drip irrigation from rainwater instead of from our municipal supply. Is another part that's, we're moving into in the future. And then, of course, we still continue just with our low water landscape rebates, and our turf conversion. Like, do you really need to have this much grass? We're also piloting this year a program where there is a low water grass seed. We want to see how well it actually does in our climate. So we've partnered with people throughout the community to give them some of the seed and for them to report back on us, how is it doing? So if we know whether or not to make this recommendation on a larger scale. Some of the things I'm going to actually talk about that haven't been as successful for us. So I mentioned our toilet code earlier on. It's been on the books since 2009, which is lower than the national and even the state average. This toilet code has been extremely effective in reducing our indoor water use for new buildings. So any new building that's, here in Flagstaff, they definitely have a 1.28 gallons per flush toilet, which is wonderful and has made a huge difference in our overall water portfolio. However, for retrofits, it hasn't been quite as successful. So for houses that were built prior to 2009, we have not been as successful in getting the toilets up to code. And there's a couple different reasons for that. There was originally, and then there was a national standard in the 1990s where they created this across the board. You need to switch to like low flow toilets. problem was the technology wasn't entirely there. Toilet manufacturers needed to quickly, follow this code, but they didn't really know when they were reducing water, they didn't know how to adequately change what their pressure was going to be to compensate for the lesser amount of water. So essentially the toilets in the 90s, the low flow toilets in the 90s were terrible. And a lot of our plumbers still remember those times, and they're like, low flow doesn't work. Of course, since then, in the decades since, they've actually created the technology and water sense is an incredibly important part of that. And that's why we insist that all of our low flow toilets are water sense for the rebate. So we know that people are getting a good quality product, that when they go lower in their water usage, that they're going to have a good product. So that was a problem. Also the sense of online commerce, like, okay, if you go to our local hardware stores and try to, purchase a toilet, it's going to be 1.28 gallons per flush. However, they can go on Amazon, or they can go down to Phoenix and very easily get a 1.6 gallons per flush toilet. And as well, we do have, a code enforcement staff that does, buildings and other things like that. And they've told us, quite frankly, that they don't have the capacity to also be able to handle, like, knowing when somebody upgrades their toilet in their house, but isn't putting in a 1.28 gallons per flush, which we understand that would be a lot for them to be able to additionally take on. So sometimes, ordinances, again, if you're not enforcing, they're problematic. And particularly if there's not really a community buy-in entirely, if they think that, this isn't what's in the best interests for them. And as well, I really quickly here have a little bit about, we were also looking to institute the pay-as-you-throw. So instead of having a one size fits all for people for when they, haul out their garbage, we're trying to incentivize people who have less waste, that they pay less in overall trash collection. One thing that they wanted to make sure to do was that people weren't just taking their trash and putting it in their recycling bin. That would later on need to be just sent to the landfill anyway. So they tried, using volunteers to help educate people if they happened to see in their recycling bin that there was stuff that didn't belong. They'd go knock on the door and try to talk to them about what can be recycled and what can't. This actually didn't go very well. A lot of people, customers were angry, like, I know how to recycle. See, look, there's a little recycling symbol on this piece of plastic, like it can be recycled. And it's like, well, in theory, yes, but we don't have anybody in our market that's willing to buy this plastic, so we can't recycle it. So it created a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation. And again, there wasn't that, they didn't have a free bag of goodies and say like, hey, you messed up, but here you go, here's a reusable water bottle or whatever, to help, as far as the education process. So again, I think just to really stress that having a good strategy, when you create ordinances and having a dedicated staff to it really helps with the overall effectiveness, and having, community buy-in, incredibly important. All right. So that's what I've got here. Do we have questions?
Oh, my camera is off. So, yep. So we have one question for now. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Emily, for your wonderful presentation. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. The one question that I received is from Rick S. You mentioned a fine of $25 after 2 or 3 warnings. Is that enough? Does the fine need to be higher to change the behavior?
We found that it's fairly successful, particularly at this point. I'm going to move back in my slides here. So as you can see, like we haven't had a double fine, since the early aughts, so to speak. For the most part, that first warning is effective enough because usually people are, it's ignorance. It's not a willful, like, this is a stupid rule and I'm not following it. People just don't know. And so once we let them know, that's usually good enough. Although, occasionally we have to go to a second time and we even get to the point where we have to fine. But it's been an incredibly long time since we've even had to do a double fine. There's been, some discussion of like, are our fines too low? Because it's still $25 to this day, It's the only place where inflation doesn't count right now, I guess. But we haven't felt the need at this point to increase our fine structure because usually, by the time, it's effective after the first violation, quite frankly, for the vast majority of our people. And it's only a very, very tiny percentage of that where it's a little bit more, we have to work with them a little bit further.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. I hope that answered the question. The second question is from Katerina. How many door hangers were placed?
How many door hangers? What?
How many door hangers were placed? So how many door hangers did you place?
So in that case, the number of violations for each year, in 2021, we did 130 of them, because that was at least the initial step, of this is the first time. We've been in the hundreds, for the last couple years. And again, have to remind people, we have a population that's constantly changing. So these were probably more likely brand new people who moved to town. Of course, in 2020, we had a huge influx of our population again, people who moved away, people who came into our community because, Flagstaff cost of living is high for us who live here, but it might be cheaper than, say, some other part of the country. So we did have a lot of new people buying homes here. We had a lot of people who chose to leave. So I imagine, we'll still be doing like 100 door hangers probably for the foreseeable future. But it certainly is a lot less than 2017 and 18. If you look at that chart there, we did 617 door hangers, that year. And I asked our enforcement officer who does mostly this, this is pretty much the only duty he does for our city. I was like, what happened that year? And he was like, we realized who were our repeat offenders and we just kind of like kept going at them very, in a very aggressive way during that time. 2018, we still had a lot of door hangers as well, 400 some, but there was finally starting to be a shift in the community itself, that the idea of having like a super green lawn wasn't even necessarily something that, the people in our community wanted as much. So our numbers started to fall because behavioral changes started to become more of the practice. It was a very long answer to that, but I hope that helps.
Yes, but she says we have 12,000 customers. So moving on to the next question, like it's from Susan. You talked about education. What is the best method that you have found works well?
So certainly I've found that in education, definitely just being out in the community and talking to people is incredibly important. And of course, we weren't able to do that as much in the last 2 years prior. We had to rely much more heavily on social media, but everybody was sort of living in a virtual world then, and trying to get through all of that was definitely a challenge. People were starting to get that, virtual fatigue. But now certainly we are doing much more going to festivals, We try to find different and creative ways to kind of reach people and, different events that speak to different audiences. So I would say that a large part is just letting people know what the watering rules are, but I see it even further in the sense of just not what our ordinance says, but actually how to be efficient in your watering landscape, and kind of talking to people about why overwatering is actually, not only is it wasteful for their pocketbook, and all that, but how it can actually be like detrimental to what they're trying to do, which is basically, create a beautiful landscape. So having that conversation as well, like instead of, water is good for my plants, so more must be better, actually having the conversation of what is enough has been incredibly important, and I think effective in switching that conversation of the concept of enough in education. So yeah.
So having the conversation and sometimes social media. Okay, the next one is from Stephanie. How many customers in your service area? So see this, it's a short answer, I guess.
So there's 77,000 people. Of course, there's more than one person per household and a lot of times. So the actual number of water bills, I don't know that off the top of my head. I do know that our population tends to have not a lot of children overall, like people have one child or so. So we have a lot of 2-3 person households, and that's about it. So I would say roughly probably about 50,000 water customers that we're looking at. But yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. And again, of course, we have fluctuations, our student population, a large portion of it is here for 9 months out of the year, and they're, water customers, and then some of them leave for 3 months and some of them don't. And then we also have a second homeowner, that comes right around May and usually stays until the end of October. So yeah, it fluctuates a lot throughout the year because of, we're a good place for sort of the reverse snowbirds, and also, we have a university here.
So Suzanne again asked what is the name of low water use grass seed?
Oh, it's Pearl's Premium is what we're piloting right now. I'd recommend that you check it out. And, we don't have that data yet. It's a pilot that we're starting this year. But yeah, for our climate, with our 4 seasons and all that, will this actually be, successful in lowering water usage? We don't want to entirely get rid of grass,
Can you repeat that one more, the name one more time?
Oh, yes. Pearl's Premium. Pearl, like the necklace.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Steven. Have you conducted direct presentations for landscape policy changes with 56 HOAs?
We have started that this past year. I've actually had a lot of success, and it's come from the people who live in the HOA that are not happy with the water bills, but they don't have a say. So we've actually done a lot more work with them over this past year since I've been here. There's the pilot program for the grass seed. Some of those HOAs are participants. As well, we've started to do be in their newsletters as well. And it's the same strategy as far as offering free moisture meters and stuff like that for the newsletters. And with that, having a conversation with the board of directors, the people who are actually in charge about efficient watering practices. It's a much friendlier approach than giving them the warnings, education's key. And so, creating a partnership, and not just that we're here to tell them that they're doing wrong. Who likes to be told that,
So Candice, one of our co-hosts, has the link for Pearl's Premium in the chat if any of you are interested. The next question is from Jason Lucas. Is well water still the only source of potable water in Flagstaff?
So no, we have surface water and groundwater, you know, and it depends on how much the amount of surface water that we have is largely dependent on the amount of snow that we get each year. So in the years when there's a lot of snow, we have a little bit more surface water to work with. Years that we don't have a lot of snow, we do have to rely a lot more on our groundwater, which, like I said, we have to drill thousands of feet below the surface to access that. So it is a much more expensive option for us. It's a lot more energy intensive as well. So we really try to utilize our surface water as much as possible. But some years it doesn't work that well. And we need to also consider that with climate change, if we have less snow overall, you know, how do we manage our water resources effectively? So yeah, and a part of that as well, since we do have so much more water usage during the summer months, utilizing the, you know, as doing robust rainwater harvesting programs and trying to encourage people just to use less water overall during the summer with climate appropriate plants. An incredibly important part of our strategy.
So we have a long question in the chat. I'll try to read it out, but if we need, we can read it again. What about a race to, quote unquote, race to bottom? Example, a program that gives an incentive for a lower water rate where if the homeowner lowers water use year over year, their rate will drop down to a new water user rate. And they are designated a perfect, quote unquote, like perfect water user. At the same time, if they water more year over year, they get a new higher rate and designated a water waster. That's quote unquote, with a frown phrased directly on their bill. Also a factor in comparison to neighbors, similar to power companies. I don't know how we would go with that, but yeah, I'll let you answer.
So I didn't talk too much about this, but just briefly touched on it in the early history. City of Flagstaff has actually created a tiered structure of water, you know, water rates that they started in the early 90s and have continued to revise, you know, over the last, you know, 30 some odd years. And yeah, and we've done a constant assessment, and the goal is to actually encourage conservation. So those people who are not using that much water, you know, we have it within the residential structure, at least we have this tiered system. And for that, you know, kind of looking at what the average number, you know, of people are in a household, we kind of create that baseline of, okay, if you're using this much water, you're not going to pay as much. If you are a water waster, you are really going to, you know, pay for that. And the difference between, like, I think it's a $5 difference, like once you really start to get into the higher, you know, categories of people who use a lot of water. Another thing in the, as far as enforcement strategy that was done in, I think 2007 or 8, they actually sent out a letter to people who are using more than 25,000 gallons per month. So this was like our highest water users. And there was like 280 people, I think, in the entire community that were these huge, and this was residential, again, water users. And kind of reminding them about the watering rules and being like, hey, you're using a lot of water, like, how about, and you're going to pay for it. You know, we're raising our rates, and, you know, so talk to us, you know.
So it's like a tire system. So you have a lower bill for lower water user and it goes higher. Basically, it wouldn't go lower than what already is, but it would go higher for higher users.
Yeah. And real quick, I will say, as far as having a tiered rate system has been essential to us getting, we are designated as having an adequate water supply, the 100-year designation for adequate water supply. And part of getting that designation, which was voluntary for us, our population is not quite high enough that it was mandated. We did it voluntarily. But a large part of that strategy was having a tiered system as an effective conservation measure.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have for today. And one thing I like, in April, we had a presentation from Robert Whiteley, who is from Syracuse City, and he also seems to tell the same message, that enforcing or doing the violation thing worked well for him to lower water, along with the outreach and other activities. So it seems like that's working. But with that, I would like to thank everyone who is here on the webinar with us. I would like to thank Emily Melhorn, Candace Seibel, and yep, have a good rest of your day. The CEU will be mailed, I guess, you'll get an email on CEUs after the presentation, I guess. Is that what it is supposed to be, Candace?
Yeah, we'll email out everybody that's in attendance the CEU info, and then this is also being recorded, so we'll get that up on YouTube shortly, and you can rewatch and share with colleagues.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Awesome.
you, Emily.